Thanks so much, everyone. In this session, we're going to look at adapting humanitarian action in a climate emergency. We're going to look in more detail at fragile and conflict-affected contexts. And maybe just to remind ourselves, and following on from what President Higgins said so powerfully earlier today, 1 in 5 children are currently living in or fleeing a war zone currently. 1 in 5 children in the world. 300 million people depend on humanitarian assistance. 100 million people, 1 in every 73 people in the world, is displaced. And humanitarian funding is declining, as we know. 823 million people experience hunger. 282 million people are acutely food insecure. And so that's just where we are today. And as we have discussed earlier today, things are just going to continue to get worse, so we have to think differently. So to discuss adapting humanitarian action in climate emergency, I am delighted to be in the company of an excellent panel of friends and colleagues. Dr. Hugo Slim is Senior Research Fellow at the Casa Institute for Social Justice at the University of Oxford. Mr. Paul Knox Clarke is Principal with Climate and Humanitarian Initiative at ADAPT. Ms. Nishanie Jayamaha is the co-lead for the Secretariat for the Climate and Environmental Charter of Humanitarian Organisations. And Mr. Maurice Sadlier is the Programmes Director for World Vision in Ireland. So welcome everybody on the panel. Hugo, I'm going to start with you. And you've written an essay recently on humanitarians and the climate emergency. And I think if you could maybe explore that a little bit with us, it will set the scene for this conversation. Thanks so much.
Rachel, thank you. And thank you for inviting me here. Thank you all and Dóchas for inviting me here. And happy birthday. I think it's a great day. 50 years is a long time. I remember it some years ago. It's a great birthday. But well done for getting there. Well done for everything you've done. And thank you also for being Dóchas, for being Irish NGOs, because I've seen a lot of you in action. I've worked with you in operational settings and in policy settings, and there is something really unique and special about Irish NGOs, the way you do it, the way you feel it. You feel it differently, as the President said, to many other organizations and cultures. And you're a very pragmatic bunch too, and you get on and do it as well. So thank you for being Irish NGOs. I'm going to try and do 4 quick things. First of all, thinking about what do we face as the humanitarian community in this climate emergency? What does this mean for humanitarian ethics and principles? What does it mean for our fundamental values and purpose? What does it mean for our practice? And I'm going to bluff that a bit and let Paul and Nisha and Maurice talk more about that. And then finally, what virtues do we need? What do we need as good ways of working? So if we think first about what do we face in this climate emergency as humanitarians, just an observation that one of the most tragic dimensions of war, and there are many terrible dimensions to war, but one of the terrible things that war is doing at the moment is that it is distracting us as a humanitarian community from this much bigger problem rolling in behind and around us. And every time there's a war, a terrible war like Gaza or Ukraine or Sudan, we're thrown into our near-view perspective to focus, and we do a sort of humanitarian swerve towards these wars and get caught in the headlights of these wars. And this is really tragic in its own way, because we need to be thinking long-term about the issues of that video. So we talk about a climate emergency. I'm preferring the phrase Earth emergency. This is a whole Earth emergency. And just to focus a little bit on words, the IPCC reports tend to use 2 or 3 words a lot. One is irreversible. So things that have happened already, like a warming climate, like lost biodiversity, like changes to landscapes and ecosystems, a lot of that is already irreversible. So we're not going to get that back, and the consequences of that are already in play, and we can't really stop them. The second big word they often use is unprecedented. So it's not going to help us that much to look at the disasters of the past, to understand what's coming at us. So the kind of disasters your agencies are going to face and the people you're helping and trying to work with are going to face are going to be unprecedented in intensity, but also in frequency. They're going to keep coming. And so that is another key challenge that we face. And the other word they use a lot is cascading. So that when something happens, it's not just that happens, it tends to trigger cascading effects. So heat waves in Brazil have set off a dengue epidemic. And these kind of cascading things are going to mean that we're going to be faced with disasters of different kinds happening. So we're talking about an Earth emergency. And as such, we're talking about humanity and nature, because it's not just humans who are suffering and threatened with death, displacement, etc. It's also nature. And the things we're going to be dealing with in this Earth emergency, and it's going to be long, so the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, are the elements. So heat, wind, rain, fire, sea, and soil. And the president mentioned soil. That thing we call the pedosphere, the 2 meters under our feet, actually which keeps us alive, the soil in which we grow the food in which we live, etc. All these things are going to be the business we're in, those elemental forces in this Earth emergency. So that's what we face. What does this mean for humanitarian ethics and for our purpose and mission and our principles as a sector? I think it means that we have to make a major moral paradigm shift. We need a new moral paradigm for our work as the humanitarian sector and for our vision and purpose. And this means a fundamental revision to our 2 fundamental principles of humanity and impartiality. Thinking of humanity, a singular focus on humans is not enough in an Earth emergency. It's not even appropriate in an Earth emergency. Humanity and nature must be seen together as the Earth community and as the suffering Earth community, and we must protect all life as humanitarians. So humanitarianism is not only for humans now, it can't be. The last 19th century, 20th century, we've made this great moral achievement of recognizing all humans as this thing we call humanity. And we have found that common humanity. We now have to find a common Earth community, and as humanitarians, work to protect and save and be compassionate to the Earth community. So there's a big change in our moral scope and purpose. So a new first principle. We also, therefore, need a new second principle. We need to revise the principle of impartiality. This needs to make 2 changes. We need to consider in impartiality, when we're not discriminating, not only human needs, but nature's needs. We have to think about the needs of nature, of plants, of forests, of animals, of ecosystems, of water systems, etc. And we need to think about the needs of the future, because we are called into intergenerational responsibility now, even as emergency workers. The future is part of the emergency of the present. And we can't just do the same thing again if it's going to be knocked down. We can't work in one way now, which then damages nature as a resource for the future, etc., etc. So we need a major ecological turn in our humanitarian principles and in our moral paradigm. And in addition, I think we need 2 new principles, one of anticipation, because we must look into the future and try and anticipate, and we're making great progress there. That needs to be a principle of action now. And adaptation also needs to be a principle of action now. So my point on what does this mean for humanitarian ethics and principles is that we need now to supersede the 1965 consensus in Vienna, which said we will have these 4 principles, humanity, impartiality. We need to do that again and agree a new humanitarian consensus on new moral purpose, which includes nature and the future. So what does this mean for practice and for organizations like yours? I think it means exactly a lot of what we saw in the video. We need new focus on disaster skills, disaster risk reduction, which we've known about for many years. We're going to have to think about how we all do that much more and much better. We're going to think about anticipation, early warning, climate services for people. We're going to think about looking at the needs of nature. Assessments cannot just be human anymore. And we're going to have to think about new areas that we haven't done much before, like heat wave management, cooling centers, etc., which you're all beginning to do. We're going to have to think about mobility, helping people to move temporarily in evacuations or seasonally or circularly. We're going to have to think probably about helping people move permanently and relocating as well, and give humanitarian accompaniment to managed retreat and other things. We're going to have to think about helping people in floods and storms. So it's different to war humanitarianism that we've been doing so well for 30 years. And we're going to have to recover and build those skills. And a key part of that, if we change our principles of humanity and impartiality, which I think we should, will mean combined human and nature programming. And that means merging organizations. The organizations, the mandates we have now, are far too separated. We can't have people just working on humans and then people working on nature in parallel. We've got to totally reform the mandates and institutions of our systems too, so that we have truly combined nature-human organizations. And that's a big challenge of organizational change, but I think you people will do it first. So I think NGOs will do that first, and you will become combined nature-human programmers, operators, and then others will follow you. And what does this mean for ways of working? I think it means some change in our mindset. So I think it means a mindset change to be future-led. We need to be led by what we think is going to happen in the future, not dominated by what's always happened in the past, and keep working as we've always done. We've got to be working to the future. Another mindset change, we've got to be landscape-led. So we've got to be thinking actually about all space that we're operating in and not just the humans in it. So we've got to be landscape-led in our approach. What do people need in that landscape? What does that landscape need? What does the ecology of that space need for it to survive and for us to survive and for people to survive? And that means we may need to change the unit of analysis we need in humanitarian action. At the moment, we talk about PINs, people in need, and we try, as the president said, to be radically individualistic and think about individuals and what they need and be focused on these counting individuals. I think we're going to have to make a change to the P, and instead of people in need, we're going to have to talk about places in need and have joint combined response to all life in that place in need. And this will become particularly inevitable when we're facing massive needs, where we can't just individually caseload millions of individuals in a place. Virtues we're going to need, and then I'm going to stop, is the first one, in terms of moral virtues, our sense of beauty. So our sense of beauty has got to evolve beyond simply seeing the beauty of the human person and saying that's who we want to save, that's what our compassion should be about. We have to extend that sense of beauty and preciousness to the natural world around us. So actually, we're seeing a shared being between humans and nature, and that humans and nature live together, and that's the beauty, and that's what we care about. So it's a big sort of change in our concept of what's beautiful, what's valuable, and that is the Earth community, and that's what we need to think about as our purpose. And so that is what we have compassion for humans and nature together. And that's where we have to find equity, for fairness in the distribution of resources and prioritizing between nature and humans so that we can live well with our ecosystems, so that we can work together. And that's where we find cooperation. You're all going to have to cooperate a lot with other organizations that are doing development and climate finance and business and whatever. But we're also going to have to cooperate with nature. So that spirit of cooperation must extend into nature-based solutions and actually cooperating with nature as one of our primary partners. And of course, this all takes courage and hope. And you are organizations and people of courage and hope, and you've shown that over your first 50 years. And I think this is the challenge for your second 50 years, is to form this new revision of humanitarianism that is an ecological humanitarianism of humans and nature together. And I think that this Earth emergency requires a humanitarian revolution as a result, and that's what we need to do. Thanks.
Thanks so much for a humanitarian revolution. So please take note of your questions, because we will give time for plenty of conversation. Paul, in your Climate and Humanitarian Action State of Play for 2024, one of the things you said is that the climate crisis is not as yet driving humanitarian transformation and renewal. And it would be useful, I think, following on from what Hugo has covered, to give us a sense of what that transformation should look like and what you're looking at in your work.
Thank you. Just before I respond to that, I would like to just say how honoured I was to be asked to speak today. So thank you very much for that. In a country and a community which I truly believe has done so much for global good. So congratulations on the first 50 years of Dóchas. Now let's talk about the next 50. In terms of I think one, if I may, I'd like to break this into two different areas, the sort of the what do we do, and then the more sort of how do we change, what does that mean for how the organizations are different. And in terms of what, I think a lot of the organizations that we work with have the very legitimate question, maybe it's a question you have, which is, well, actually we do disasters, we do floods. Why is a climate-induced flood different from a flood? How actually does climate make it different? And I think that's a very good question. I think there are probably two answers, and they go to the kind of things that are different. The first thing is that climate makes it different because there are certain new kinds of disasters, as Hugo suggested, particularly heat, which, as many of you will know, is a real killer. But also things like glacial lake outbursts and air pollution, which I think we're probably not putting enough attention onto, particularly in urban environments, wildfires as well. So the first thing that we need to do is new operating procedures, new ways of working for disasters that we haven't really done before generally, and we don't necessarily understand very well. But the other thing is that a flood isn't just a flood, because it's again, as Hugo said, what we're actually dealing with is much more frequent, far more violent natural disasters, climate-related disasters, to the degree that in many places it's essentially a permacrisis. It's not episodic. And those are affecting people who are made far more vulnerable because the climate is also taking away the bases of nutrition, healthcare, and so on. So how can we respond to that? I think there are broadly three ways, or three ways that I've seen thus far. The first response to that reality is to climate-proof our activities. We talked earlier on about migration, and those of you who've been in temporary shelters, the tents that are often handed out, know that those tents are very, very hot. And you add another couple of degrees, and they're not just hot, they're deadly, particularly for women, actually, because women are often confined within that space. Similarly, those displaced people in those tents are often in areas which are peculiarly likely to flood because they tend to get the bits there that nobody else wants. So there's a whole load of work that is just good practice around ensuring the safety of the people who we are there to support and ensuring the safety of the supply chains that are there to support them. And it's not really happening in many cases yet. It would be a shame if it had to wait for mass deaths for that to happen. So the first thing is climate proofing. The second is, I think, disseminating information and engaging with communities about the realities of climate change. Many communities are aware that something is happening, and they're experts in surviving in difficult situations, but they're not necessarily aware of how this is going to unfold over the next decade. So for agency, to allow people to have agency, they need to have the information. So humanitarians becoming more engaged in those conversations, I think is very important. And then the third thing, which maybe we'll go into a bit more, is this idea of not just responding, but actually actions to get ahead. And those might be resilience kind of activities, decreasing the vulnerability of people, although, as we know, those have proved extremely difficult to make work in conflict-affected states. But there are some interesting new developments, I think, there. Preparedness activities, community-based preparedness, which doesn't get anything like the funding it should, given the extremely good return you get for that. And anticipatory action, which I think is an emergent area which is interesting and important, but probably isn't the silver bullet that some people are claiming it to be. So that's the what. Do I have time to go on to the how?
Please do.
Thank you. To do that, and to be an organization that usefully engages with this scale and ferocity of crisis on so many different fronts. The model that we're all based in, and it's not just us, because it's the money and it's the international structures, but the model we're based in is basically a model which was designed for a world which is now over. The episodic responding, pouring money into a pipe in Brussels or Washington or Dublin, and then it comes out and international people do things and then they go away. Yeah? That response model is not going to work now. So the how of that is, well, firstly, and it's dull but so necessary, quality and efficiency. There's still too much program that's just not very good. And we need to squeeze the absolute maximum of assistance out of every euro. So a real focus on that. Localization. But going beyond just not that it's not important, but going beyond localization, which is transferring funding to local organizations, particularly organizations which have been created in the image of northern organizations, to really work with the fabric, the economic, political, and social fabric that's there. So that's a very different kind of work, because that's becoming facilitators. It's engaging with and filling small gaps. Related to that, and perhaps the most difficult thing on the list about how we change the way we work, is humility. Because humanitarians are not very good at not being the loudest people in the room, in my experience. Being a minor player in a big and diverse coalition and learning how to do that for all of us, I think is going to be very important. And related to that, those coalitions need to maintain over time. And so a call really to the donors, but to all of us, is to be thinking about how are we contributing in the long term? How do we have money that allows us to work over time, rather than doing 6 months, 6 months, 6 months. Now, that's quite a big list. President Higgins asked us to think about our capacity to change. And I think it is a very big ask for us to make those kind of organizational and systemic changes that would allow us to be doing those things. But I would also suggest that really there are three options. Either we fail, or a new system for addressing these situations develops and we are not part of it, or a new system for developing these situations develops and we have changed enough to be part of it. But not doing anything is not really one of the options.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul. I think there's a huge amount there. Maybe. And before I come to Nishanie, just listening to some of the conversations earlier and the pace of change and the pace of realizing exactly how bad things are, and as you said, that the world, the state of the world has just passed out this model of humanitarian action. And in the last couple of weeks, we had floods in Dubai, we had floods in Afghanistan. The response in both places, there's no comparison. We had floods in Kenya, and we had floods in Brazil. And in Kenya, and I think as you mentioned, Atya, the poorest people who live in the informal settlements are the people who are now looking at their homes being bulldozed and being told, well, you can't go back there, but there's nowhere for you to go. So Nishanie, I want to come to you, and if you could explore some of these themes a little bit further and how the Environment Charter can actually help us to start moving forward, but actually moving forward in a principled and a really committed way.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, having me here, rather, and it's really lovely to be here. One of the things that I really found out yesterday while I was walking around Dublin, my first time here, was that Dóchas meant hope in Irish. I did not know that. I'm Sri Lankan, so clueless. But I was like, oh, I'm here for a conference to talk about climate and sustainability. So very fitting, and happy birthday. And for the next 50 years, there's quite a few things that we all need to do. And the Climate and Environment Charter came about because of this need that we saw. And as Hugo said, that there is a gap in the principles, that the humanitarian principles that we have and been following so far. And we felt that between the work we do in conflict and fragile contexts especially, and even other contexts like Bangladesh or in Fiji, etc., we've been finding that we're struggling more and more to deal with multiple issues and challenges, and we as humanitarians who are responding to emergencies are not able to do this in a siloed approach anymore. So we talk about system change, we talk about nexus approaches. For those who may not know, the humanitarian development, peace, and now climate nexus that people talk about because it is obvious on the ground. And for communities on the ground, the needs they face, or even for the ecosystem that we need to talk about, is that these are not a siloed approach. The challenges that we face are real, important right now, and they're evolving almost every day. It's not just, I need food, water, a shelter. I need to look at schooling of my children. I need to look at safety, security of my family. If it's in conflict context, I need to look at, long-term planning about what would I need to do in my livelihood if I'm not now, going to be a farmer or a pastoralist to move. So these are the challenges that we as humanitarian organizations started seeing. And that development of the charter, the climate and environment, and it's not just environment, it's not climate only, it's climate and environment that we need to look at in a holistic manner. And these two principles came about of how do we build resilience of communities, but also our own organizations to face these impacts of climate change that are now compounding on many other issues like the debt crisis, economic crisis. I'm Sri Lankan. We have a whole load of crises that keep getting whacked at us beyond just conflict for 30 years, tsunami, economic crisis. And and Sri Lanka was considered a middle-income country, right? Where are we now? And this is the case for other countries who are less than middle income and are even behind. And you're seeing a backsliding of the Sustainable Development Goals, all these principles, even health. So how do we work collectively? And it's a cooperation or collective action. And that charter principles of the 5th commitment of the charter, and I hope you can please take a look at the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations. If you haven't signed up, sign up for it. Ask, is that when we are looking at working at a country context, and this is where you, as a network of NGOs with double, triple, quadruple hats are here, is are you even talking to your own organization between departments, for example? I've heard some of our big members who are INGOs come and tell us, we're struggling to get our climate colleagues on board. Or I've been talking to climate change colleagues and going, we're not sure if the humanitarians can change because they've been so focused on this, 1 year programmatic. Of course, the funding of it is important, etc. But then collective action can happen at variety levels, at country level. How do we look at a holistic approach to solve a crisis that you cannot solve on your own as a humanitarian? How do we talk to our climate actors, our rights-based actors? Some of you are all 2, 3, right? But there's outside our circle. We live in a bit of a bubble when we are in these contexts. How do we get out of that comfort zone and go approach someone? And let them understand that in a conflict and fragile context, the ways of working is very different because the risk that humanitarian actors take, being in a context that you are bombed, shelled, your money is taken, loads of things. You have other problems that we have to deal with as well, right? And safety, security for your communities that you're working with, access to them. So how do we then work and make other organizations also understand, let's try work together. How can we share, build trust, to be able to now start working across the board? How do we change this sort of working? And one of the maybe examples that we as a network, so coming from my old hat, I was ICVA's climate lead. And for those who don't know ICVA, it's the International Council of Voluntary Agencies. It's a humanitarian NGO network. Dóchas is a member, half of you here are members of it, so very proud. What we did was we actually started reaching out to climate and environment organizations like CAN International. And we did an advocacy looking at macro picture then, and how do we call out issues that were not necessarily issues that the humanitarian actors were dealing with. We did a loss and damage call for action that together, 2 big networks came together to say, listen, we understand, and we had differences, believe me. Like the humanitarians are like, oh, but this is beyond the humanitarian principles. We don't talk about climate justice. We don't talk about rights-based approaches. I'm like, but humanitarian is a basic right? Climate justice is a different thing. It talks about reparation. It talks about a lot of other things. But in the end, the principles that we're asking for is equity, access, and this is all to communities who are most vulnerable, the least involved in action, most marginalized, and are the ones who are suffering the most for something they did not have a part of or had the least amount of part of. So how do we get together and start talking? We have different languages. Climate change has a different language. Humanitarians have different language, development has different language, but in the end, what are we trying to do on the ground? We all meet to serve needs, right? So how do we do that better together? And then when you start breaking these silos and words and language and ideologies and principles and all down, in the end, it boils down that we have similar goals, similar objectives, and how can we do that better and call that out? Call it out to governments, call it out to even UN agencies, call it out to our own selves to step up and say, listen, we need to do better, and how can we change and how can we do it better?
And can you say a little bit about who is signing up and how difficult is it to get everybody thinking in the same direction? And I'll come back to this question later, again, after Maurice has spoken, but it'd be interesting to see who signed up to the Charter.
Yeah, so interesting, we have 400 plus signatories now, and that includes UN agencies, Red Cross, Red Crescent Movement, including local, national Red Cross movements, INGOs, national NGOs, local actors, academia, researchers, think tanks, and including states. So we have 13 supporters. The last two to join up was Australia and Japan. We would like to have Ireland on board too. That'll be great. EU ECHO is on board as well. So it's interesting that we didn't expect, for example, member states to sign up to it. It was not meant for states. It was meant for humanitarian organizations. But it seemed like there was a need and there was a momentum to say, this makes sense, and we would see ourselves to see how can we get on board. We have UNICEF, UNHCR, OCHA, and IOM who've signed up to the Charter. So there's a lot of, so there is ways of connecting with such a wide constituency that has a similar goal and similar common objectives to do better in the sector.
Great. Thanks very much, Nishanie. Hugo, you look like you wanted to ask a question.
No, I'm thinking.
Okay, great. Maurice, over to you. And many people in the room will know Maurice and your work in World Vision. But one of the themes from the previous conversation that connects very nicely into what you were going to talk about, as well as World Vision's work, is this concept of fairness and the expectations that we have of communities and the work that they're going to do in the situations that they're in. But I might hand over to you to elaborate.
Thanks, and it's one of the disadvantages of coming at the end of the day. Everyone's already said everything we wanted to say. But I think Atia put it really nicely, talking about the loans. It's shifting the responsibility. And I have it kind of makes me uncomfortable when we start talking about mitigation and the communities we work with. I think, and Si read out Mary's point around climate justice earlier, from a climate justice perspective, my feeling is we have to help these communities adapt, become resilient to the impacts of climate change. I don't like the idea that we're asking them to mitigate the impacts of climate change. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen or it can't happen by some of the activities we do, but our first and foremost responsibility is to help those communities adapt to the climate crisis that we created in the global north, and something that our responsibility to do is. I'm not saying that the mitigation doesn't have to happen, and kind of to look at that whole, it's really complex, and I think the last panel looked at it really well, and I was in South Sudan the end of March, and I'm in Upper Nile, in Malut. You pass by oil extraction fields to go to communities that are absolutely devastated by the impacts of climate change. I was there this time, schools were closed because of the heat wave. The year before I was there, schools were closed because of the floods, all impacted by climate change. And it's not a comfortable conversation you can have with communities there to say, the oil that you're extracting is contributing to the problem that you're facing. It's just kind of too theoretical, to be honest. And even in those cases, the benefits of the oil extraction is not getting to the communities. It's going outside the country. It's the financial flows that are going outside. I do think as INGOs, as donors in the global north, we have a responsibility for the finance, capacity, and technologies to ensure that these communities and the countries have the ability for this new development pathway that is different to ours. We sit here because we have a development pathway based on fossil fuels. We now have to ask these countries to follow a development pathway that, in fairness, is yet untested. And how do we do that? And I think some of it is around engaging with our own national governments here, and that is where our advocacy colleagues come on board. It is engaging with global systems, but recognizing the real difficult challenge that it is, and really moving it forward this way. I think maybe to add on what people are saying around silos, and it's saying the same thing, but I think we all have to get over ourselves. We're not developments, we're not humanitarian, we're not advocacy, we're all one, and we have to start thinking much more about that. And when I think of where we've done acute emergency responses in the last year, it's Vanuatu, it's Mauritania, it's Uganda. our development colleagues need to have humanitarian skills, our humanitarian colleagues need to have development skills, and we all need to know about climate. So we need to move forward in a different mindset. The climate is creating a whole different approach for us. I thought I was going to be the first person to talk about the nexus, but thankfully Nishanie. No, I'm glad not to be the first one, but I think I really like one of the OECD DAC nexus principles, and I always have to read it out because I can't remember it. An approach, operational setup, and financing mechanism that help navigate short-term realities and the evolving context without losing sight of the long-term development perspectives. And that's what we need. And we need that within our own programs. We need that from donors to help us have that flexibility. To do that, I think we're lucky with Irish Aid. We have a level of flexibility. If you look at the European Union, it's absolutely a nightmare. You're looking at a year before you can change to a context. Some of the examples, and kind of Jane Ann was warning us, we better bring some examples. We've built it into our programs. In Somalia, we see a drought. We know the impacts of a drought. Our girl child will be kept out of school. We trigger a cash response so the families of girl children or children with disability get a cash transfer. So therefore, the hope is their children will be able to continue to go to school because they're not extracted for other work. In Vanuatu, we see 2 cyclones hit within 2 days of each other, made worse because of climate change. Again, we trigger a response where we provide seeds and tools to the community so they can quickly recover. Your response is different in those countries because people's level of vulnerability is inevitably different. Somebody in Somalia has much less resilience to respond than somebody in Vanuatu. But because of climate, I think we have to look at what is that sort of short-term reality that we need to respond to and what are the systems we put in place to make us do that. And then all be development, because that's whether we're humanitarian or development workers, essentially what we're looking at is the development of a country and a community. So that's what we all are, regardless of the label we like to put on ourselves.
Thanks, Maurice. And we have about 20 minutes. I think you should get a clap because everybody else has a clap in the interest of fairness.
We were still mulling your...
Yeah.
We were thinking about it still.
So we have about 20 minutes, and we might just open up the conversation, and then we'll invite questions. So I'd like to just ask all the panelists. So Hugo, you spoke about a humanitarian revolution. Paul, you spoke about we need to fail or we need to change. You spoke about collaboration, and you spoke about just getting over ourselves in very practical terms. And so I think the question still is how. And Hugo, you know, in the work that you do, what kind of reaction are you getting when you present this idea of a new paradigm? What kind of reaction are you getting from different groups?
I don't know, because I haven't done it before.
Right.
Because I only wrote the book. I've got to finish it next week, so I've been writing it over the last couple of months. So it's the first time I've sort of come out as an ecological humanitarian. and hence my tie, because I would usually be red with the Red Cross or something. I don't know what reaction I get. I think one of them is I did get from the MSF angle, which is, come on, but we've got to be practical here, all this sort of high-flying ethics. But so what I would say to that is, I think you know, MSF's a great example. If you're working in a place and you're working understanding it's an Earth emergency and you're actually concerned about the Earth community of which humans and everyone else is a part, then you have to take the One Health policy. You have to say, I'm concerned about health for the planet, for everybody on the planet, all life, all health. So you say, our organization isn't fit for purpose because it's full of doctors wanting to be obsessed with human bodies. That's not good enough, okay? So you've got to cram in the vets, you've got to cram in the ecologists and the ecosystems people and make a new MSF, which really is health without borders, and it's without borders of species as well, et cetera, et cetera. That's what you've got to do.
What did MSF say?
Well, I haven't said it to them yet either. I'm rather...
Well, they'll hear about it.
But, that's what we've got to do, and that's what everyone's got to do. And it's an Earth emergency. The phrase climate emergency is a bit misleading, because the climate causes the Earth emergency, but it's an Earth community emergency.
Thank you. Paul, can you pick up on that then and explore what that adaptation should look like and where you're seeing maybe some good examples? Because it's similar language. I mean, we need to adapt, we need to change our thinking, we need to change our structure. So over to you.
Well, I think the best way, I think the first thing is that we all have to acknowledge, I have to acknowledge because I'm part of it, that the humanitarian world is excellent at resisting change. It's fabulous at resisting change. It's managed to resist significant change on most issues since I graduated, actually, and that's not yesterday. But where change has happened, it generally has happened, I think, not through IASC statements and policies, but actually through people doing things. So if you look at cash, which is perhaps one of the more significant changes that's happened, people started with cash, and then because the changes started to happen, other elements of the system are called into question, and the change ripples out across the system. So personally, I'm a big believer in do it and allow the change to grow from that, rather than writing, than coming up with policy. One organisation that I think is doing it very well, and I should declare an interest because I'm an advisor for them, is an organisation, International Medical Corps, because they said, well, we don't know the answer for what climate means for humanitarian health, although now they do. And we're not going to come up with something and at HQ level and roll it out and tell people what to do. Instead, they created a small internal fund, and they asked each of their countries, if the country was interested, if the energy was there, and believe me, it really was on the ground for most of the countries, to say, what are the climate risks that you're facing, and what are you going to do about them? And so you come up with a really wide variety of different kinds of activity. Some of them are, to give examples, in Mali, they're working very much with the Ministry of Health on maintaining health provision, so doing disaster DRR work in the health facility and also training health staff. In Somalia, they're looking at heat and working about how could we decrease mortality from cardiovascular disease in heat events. But in Zimbabwe, they're doing food security work around water and how do you do food. So you've got all these different things going on, and they're going to let it run for a year. And after a year, they're going to bring in the learning and see if there are any common denominators under those different approaches. And I think that is a really nice example of doing it and then seeing how that leads to change rather than kind of trying to do it from top down.
Great, thanks. Maurice, would you like to maybe pick up on that from a World Vision perspective in terms of what you're doing?
Yeah, I think there's one of the things, again, it's back to Nexus. It is really understanding the context and knowing how we adapt to that context. So it's thinking, what is changing, or what do we see the trends as coming down the track? So is it the weather forecast, or is it working with the communities on increasing levels of violence because of more pressure on resources? And what then can we do as a program within that to adapt to that change? But also, what are others doing? It's knowing what's happening in the area, what other people are doing, what is our role, what are other people doing. I think it's more from the development side, but we have a really nice process we're going through at the moment, which is quite long, but really useful. We're designing a new program with the donor. So we're doing it together, and part of that work, and it's kind of going back to what you were saying, Hugo, it's World Vision, the World Wildlife Fund, and a marine conservation organization working together. So it's looking at what our role is, what their role is, and coming together to go, so it is nearly an Earth system approach. But one of the prerequisitions of funding is to do an environmental and social impact assessment now. So as we design the program, we have to do this environmental social impact assessment and design the program responding to that. So we're already going, well, what impact will this program have on the environment? What impact does the environment have on this program? And what impact can the intervention we want to do have on people? So looking at marine protection and what are the implications of loss of access to resources in the sea? If this is a marine protected corridor, what's happening to people's livelihoods and helping them with alternative livelihoods? to do this is expensive. So this donor is actually providing us with funds to do this environmental impact assessment up front. It's the Blue Action Fund, which Ireland contributes, and a few other donors. So it's a new way of working for us. It's quite rigorous, but we're already going, well, this will be a better result. This will be a better program because of the process that we're following to do that.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Nishanie, I have 2 questions for you, but maybe one will come up when in conversation. But we talked a little bit about risk and people's understanding of risk and the idea that we're still quite shocked when these big events seem to happen and the readiness to respond and so on. So in your advocacy work and relating back to the signatories of the Charter, how are people grasping the risks that are actually becoming reality very, very quickly?
Okay, that's a loaded question. But okay, so if you take risk in terms of climate risk, okay, there's a variety of risks that we're talking about, right? So if you're talking about climate risk and how they're grasping risk at programmatic level and at design level, I think we need to think about it as how gender was in the past, I keep saying. How do you make sure you're incorporating it in your planning, design thinking, in your programming? And many of us don't have this headspace. One is language of where communications, we talked about this earlier in the last, how are communications shared with communities to even understand what a risk is, an environment risk is, or a climate impact risk is? Do they have the wherewithal to understand, oh, we need to evacuate? I mean, in Sri Lanka, when we looked at tsunami warnings, you have to have clear messaging in multiple languages of the communities where they are to say it's only a warning, but now you stay. Next one is it's an evacuation. You have to move. But where do you move? If you don't know where to move, you're going to be, oh, I'm going to stay here. I'd rather be at home and not. And sometimes people don't want to move and leave their livestock or leave their homes, etc. So it's very interesting how you take that into board. And then when you're looking at multiple aspects of how do you program for different communities, extremely marginalized communities who barely get reached, we don't even go and talk to them because we don't understand sometimes that, okay, this particular community might be marginalized. And within local actors, we need to understand who do we talk to very well to understand that, these communities within this tribe or within this community is extremely marginalized. If you look at India, there's the Dalit community, there's a lot of awareness about it, so as a result, we know. But most often in context we work in, we may not be aware. And then we talk about how do we look at risk in general of actors taking on risk as organizations and looking at that perspective of the risk, right? So even actors, we have a lot of risks that we take on when we take funding or we do a project or a program on the ground. And is that risk shared equally down the line to the local community actor who's actually working on the ground with communities so that they are able to absorb it, they are building their resilience in the long term. We talk about funding and financing and how much of trickles down to the percentage. That's that risk that is taken on. Are we now, as Paul said, we need to work differently. It's not the international going and working anymore. We're talking about how do we build conservation, long-term planning. The communities there themselves, the local organizations need to have ownership. And for that ownership to take place, you need to consult, you need to give them that wherewithal to go ahead with it. We need to transfer not only risk, we need to transfer technology, we need to transfer knowledge, ideas. They have knowledge. Are we taking that? I'm going beyond risk, but it's a holistic system of looking at that transferring of different varieties and how do we take that forward. I may have gone a little beyond that. But
that's great, but I think there's a real theme that we hadn't kind of picked up on when we were prepping brilliantly for this session, which is this need for a holistic shift. Yeah. And that's hugely challenging to get everybody accepting that we've only one direction to go in, and that is a direction of change in order to be able to to address all the risks and be able to survive as multiple species and so on. We might open it up to the floor. I think we have about 15 minutes if there are questions. If you'd like to direct the question to a particular panelist, then please indicate that.
Thank you very much. My name is Morton. I'm from Malawi. I'm a student at the University of Kobe doing MA International Development. Maurice is smiling because we've met before. That's why my question is coming to you.
I already answered all the questions.
You've mentioned something about moving from focus on mitigation to adaptation. I understand the reasoning behind it, the rationale behind it, but then I'm just wondering how are we framing it to make sure that we are still retaining this sense of agency? Because to me, dropping the aspect of mitigation would somehow give the impression of helplessness on the people. Like, we have resigned that there's nothing we can do about it. In as much as I understand the reasoning behind it, like the work is in the global south, they're not really responsible. We're not really responsible for whatever is happening to us. We cannot, there's really little that we can do to change this, but then dropping the idea of mitigation entirely would mean resigning to the state of hopelessness and, well, there's nothing we can do about it. How are we framing it to ensure that the aspect of urgency that the president mentioned is still being retained in the work that we do? Thank you.
And I suppose there's two ways I would look at it. One, why should somebody in South Sudan have to take on the responsibility to mitigate the climate impacts created by me sitting here in Dublin, burning my gas, my coal, driving my car? I think the onus is on me. I believe there should be urgency, but the urgency for mitigation has to be on the global north. That is our first and foremost responsibility. We have to provide that. I don't think we can transfer that burden to communities who are least responsible. The communities that I visit in Solomon Islands, who live in outer islands, who don't have vehicles, that don't have electricity in their communities. Why are they suddenly denied a development pathway? Whereas I can sit here in Dublin and go to the shop and buy coal and have to run natural gas for my house. So it's not getting rid of the level of urgency on mitigation, it is the responsibility of, I just feel uncomfortable when we start saying, this project is great because it's going to mitigate the impacts of climate change. That's not fair. That's not, as an international NGO, I don't feel that's my responsibility for the communities I'm here to serve. It may be for governments. I'm not saying that governments, and we see many of the governments in the global south are really, really strong. Many of the small island development states are much stronger in their net zero targets than any of the European countries. But they need the finance, they need the technology and the capacity building to be able to do so. So it's just looking at it from a climate justice perspective and what is fair and what is equal.
That's a great question. Thank you. Nishanie, you want to come in, and then you, Paul.
Yeah, sorry. I think I could flip that around as well at the same time, saying we have, so when I was having conversations with charter signatories and ICPA members who are sometimes one and the same, we had a youth group from Zimbabwe. They were Rwandan refugees in Zimbabwe. And they came up and said, listen, we are doing this work where we are going towards our own community in Rwanda, in the camps, to say, listen, stop polluting, stop using plastic, let's start doing some form of work where we are replanting trees, making sure that the environment we're in, which is not our own country, who are hosting us, but we'd like to keep it greener and make it much more better and safer, because in the end, we might live in this country longer. We don't know. That's the reality on the ground. But we are glad that this country and these people and this, whose community has accepted us, we are cutting down, we're seeing that our community is cutting down trees, very simple, basic stuff that happens, in day to day, to use it for firewood. So how do we raise awareness? And so they themselves came up with a project, started fundraising, and started looking at what can we do in our own little space to be more environmentally sustainable, to do no harm, to do better in a little way as possible as how much we can. So that's part of it. And in the Climate and Environment Charter, that is the second commitment, which is there's a little leeway and a lean into building communities' resilience to face impacts of climate change, but our own impact on the environment. How can we do better? And that is what it is when we are looking at that sustainability piece more than the mitigation. Yes, we're looking at carbon accounting and carbon tools and all these guidance and tools that are coming up now in the sector. But if we are looking at waste management, how are we managing this waste better? That we're not polluting the place that we are now in and our communities and our refugees are in. How are we looking at regeneration? How are we looking at nature-based solutions to solve some of the crises that is already there, that's exacerbating some of the tensions within communities that are causing conflict, and how can we change that to make it a more sustainable modality of working. And those are kind of the things that we can do in wherever we are. And if refugee youth who have nothing can do it, I think we can do it too.
Thanks, Nishanie.
I wanted to thank you, Morten, for the question, because I hadn't really seen it from that perspective before, a global solidarity perspective, as I understand you're saying, and giving people a sense of agency. So I would have to think about that. But I also think that it's worth bearing in mind that, say, Somalia, for example, similar to South Sudan, it will take Somalia 3 years to produce the carbon emissions that the USA produces in a day. And if you start from that kind of jumping off place, my concern is not about work in Somalia and mitigation activities in Somalia in general. It's about the specific use of humanitarian resources for mitigation activity, because we're finding it's much easier to get 5% or a 10%, 5% normally, on the budget for those sort of mitigation activities than it is to get 5% on the budget to make the primary healthcare centres safe for babies to be in. And so I think, as with all, it is slightly a zero-sum game with that humanitarian budget as it's currently understood. And so I think it's difficult to make the argument that we should be taking that money to, solarize when there are other needs there.
Okay, there's a lot in that answer. I'm sure there's more questions. There's a lot in that. I think that's a really big dilemma. There's a lady here. You had a question, and we probably have time for maybe three questions. And then,
Hi. I'm a results-oriented person. I'm the head of monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning and goal. So I was wondering, keeping with the theme of adopting humanitarian action in climate emergency, how do you measure that? What will the results of that look like? If you could make some suggestions. And we've talked about the how, the activities. I'm more talking as that you really, averted, I suppose, climate, not at the large scale, global, but although, of course, there are advocacy, etc., and diplomacy work that we do that, does intend that as well. So you can look at that at every level you want, of course, but yeah, some suggestions, I think, concrete would be great. Thank you.
Would anybody like to take that? That's quite a difficult question.
What would the results look like?
And I'm thinking here, actually, what Paul said. I know if I put this question to our humanitarian colleagues, what they will say that, I used to be a humanitarian myself, is about the resistance to change and why would you throw this question, to us as well, let us do the work. But I think it's still worth thinking about. Thank you.
I'll give you one example. Not doing the same thing again. So South Sudan, we build a school. Floods come, school is gone. If you're adapting in humanitarian and you've put in proper disaster risk reduction or anticipatory action, you're not redoing that same activity. You're saving your assets. Or the bounce back ability of a family. How did those girls remain in school that got the cash transfer because of our trigger response? Or what negative coping mechanisms, some of it we've been doing for years, what negative coping mechanisms were not enacted by a family or an individual because of the early intervention we did in our response?
Do you want to jump in?
Go ahead.
I think it's a really important issue because unlike almost everything else we do, there aren't good practices or standard operating procedures. And so every project that we do that is about humanitarian adaptation should really be designed with a learning function in mind. Because until we have the evidence base, we don't know what we should be investing in and what we're not. And I think there are some directions that we're going in that are not perhaps a particularly good use of very finite resources around climate. So I don't know how, but underlining your point about the importance of the doing of the thing, I would strongly agree with. When it comes to measuring the process of change, so the other side of things, how are our organizations, how is the system changing? Obviously, that's a whole thing in itself, and it's very difficult. But there was that whole process around measuring the outcome of the World Humanitarian Summit. What was it called?
World Humanitarian Summit Secretariat?
The Grand Bargain.
Grand bargain.
Wait,
The
Grand
Grand
Bargain?
The Grand Bargain.
Oh,
Thank you. Now, methodologically, I'm sure that it's problematic in many, many ways, but it's good enough to show that actually not much is happening. And maybe that's as good as you need.
And maybe to a response. So when you're talking to organizations that have been doing some of this work on the ground for a long time, not because because they've had to, no choice. Community needs are as such, as I mentioned before. And when we asked them, they were like, we're not doing any adaptation work. What is that? And this is to more so humanitarian organizations or in between. We are risk reduction, we're helping communities do XYZ, helping them to, with their cash for work money that they have, we're helping them build bunds, etc. And when I ask, okay, that seems a little like adaptation, and this is the thing, we don't, have a lot of insight into humanitarian programs doing a lot more of that long-term work that, though they have been, they don't label it. So it's a little bit of rethinking also of the labels that are used. I mentioned this before. We don't label it this. But now more and more organizations are coming and telling us, we should actually rethink the way we are doing risk reduction work, disaster risk reduction. We're doing community-based disaster risk reduction work. We don't really call it that, but it is that. So I think then it becomes difficult to measure it. But then going back to solar panels, picking that up, we had Acted, for example, who actually made the case with their donors to want to put up solar panels because every year when they asked for funding, they had to ask for $150,000 to put up the generator for their little health care facility in the camp and for the camp to have electricity, right? And $100,000, $150,000, $100,000, $150,000. Fourth year coming, they're like, we asked you at the beginning for $300,000 to put up a solar panel farm that can be looked at maintenance for longer term. And if now, on the fourth year, we are asking you for another $150,000, now we've come to up to 600 and something thousand. For the 3 years we've been asking you for money. If you gave us that $300,000, you would have saved half of the cost and had something to be there for longer term, of course, taking into account maintenance, training, ensuring that that panel system is going to last a little longer, and making sure that that then not only supports that community in the camp, but also a host community, etc. And the host community is coming now to that facility to get healthcare services, etc. So it's looking at a little bit of this way of working that we need to get. Examples are hard to come by still. It's coming, slowly trickling, but I'm sure in your own organizations you have these examples. Sharing this doesn't mean that they may be best practice. Sometimes it's the bad practice that we need to share because we did it, oops, didn't work. Giving that.
Great at that as a sector.
Yeah. And then also advocating to donors to say, listen, we are definitely going to fail because we don't know, we're learning. And we need to have that honest conversations of where we're failing and where we're succeeding. And if we're not, well, let's figure out what we do, right?
Thanks, Nishanie. I'm going to bring Hugo in, and then we'll take one last question from Atia, and then we'll have to wrap it up. Yeah.
Just a tiny point on that, because I think I agree with everything that's been said. One good thing to monitor is that you haven't kept doing something that didn't work, which is Maurice's point, and then Paul's point and Nish's point that you've got to slowly look and see what evidence is forthcoming about whether adaptation works. That's really important. Because things are going to be unprecedented, because they will create cascades, then you're never going to be on this linear path of once you've done an adaptation, you're fine. So one of the things you're going to have to be looking for very constantly is for early signs of maladaptation. In other words, where it's not just good enough to say we've adapted and we're still doing that. They're still planting these new crops. They're still doing that. If actually something else has happened, which means that's now a maladaptation. So that's very tricky. And of course, I would say you've got to widen your spreadsheet to include results for nature. And what's happening to the trees, what's happening to the seas, what's happening, etc. How it works for the Earth community. So yeah, you're going to have to go from A4 to A3 or whatever you use at the printer. I don't know.
We'll take one more question here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's certainly interesting to see the perspective from humanitarian organizations. And because I don't come from the space, I think one of the biggest positives is that the humanitarians are the ones prepared for crises, are the ones used to the quick reactions, are the ones used to making emergency-based decision-making. And I think in this particular scenario of climate, that is a real powerful value add when it comes to bringing these conversations forward, which I didn't hear, but that's maybe because I don't come from the humanitarian space. I wanted to remind that it's really important. But I heard two things that I think are quite useful. One is that, and we don't always give ourselves the time to think. And I think that this is also a case for having expert working groups and reference groups and making sure that the thinkers are in the spaces all the time. And we say this in all spaces, but I think it's particularly important to have the emergency thinkers and the quick thinkers ready, to respond in this space. So that is one thing that I'm taking away from this. But the second thing is this whole conversation around the data collection. And this is such a huge, diverse group of NGOs. They've been collecting data forever, and I really like this conversation you're bringing in about a different approach for different countries. And I think putting all of that together will allow us to respond to each change as it comes, because we cannot predict the change. But that is as close as we're going to be able to get to it. And in the concept of state building, I think that's where how are these states being built and what comes first and when becomes really useful. But now my question, which is a challenge, which is if we flip this whole mitigation and adaptation conversation on its head, our conversation has been about how the South mitigates and how the South adapts. But what if we were to live in a utopian world where we don't ask the Southern states to make changes? Not that I don't want us to. We also need to play our part. But how do we make sure that that responsibility of those that caused it, how should they be mitigating? How should they be adapting very concretely in the global north so that there is that shared equality and that whole fairness that we've been talking about. I don't know if you have the answer. I don't have the answer, but it's just what I'm thinking based on your conversation, which is fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. So if we maybe go quickly around just your thoughts. It's a big question, yeah, but I think it's a really important one. So Hugo, should we start with you?
So on that last question, I mean, I think this is the point about this Earth emergency. It's a universal emergency. So, you've seen catastrophic wildfires across California, huge, flooding across the eastern seaboard of the States. You've seen forest fire. It's everywhere. So if you're asking how the North is adapting, well, one sign of early adaptation is that insurance has ended. Okay? So, State Farm, other companies have said we're not insuring any new houses in California or Florida or whatever. So that's a massive shock to the system. So the North is being shocked too. So then people are saying, right, I've got no insurance for my house, or it's just doubled, or whatever. So I think we're seeing these big shifts in the North, which will force adaptation of different kinds, whether it's movement, whether it's rebuilding in different ways. But the idea that the North is not part of this emergency is simply not true, and it's really not going to be true for very much longer. So, there's going to be a lot of suffering and impoverishment in the North over the next few years as well. So they will have to adapt.
It's quite sobering that the expectation is still on Global South because it hasn't actually hit home in the scale that it will make change. Paul?
No, I was going to say one of the things that the organizations here, many humanitarian or mixed mandate humanitarian development peace organizations are very, very good at is advocacy with their own domestic public. And I think to the degree that our organizations are advocating for a situation where not only ABC NGO follows certain voluntary, but there are legal requirements around the supply chain and around the shipping and around the transport where we fly people around. That would be a better focus, I think, for our mitigation activity or as good a focus at least, maybe, I'll be less controversial, for our mitigation activity in Dublin or in London than some of the current things that we're doing.
I'm Sri Lankan. I can tell you 120 things that the Sri Lankan government needs to do, for example, from the Global South. But so I'm based in Geneva and I live in Switzerland right now. And one of the things I see, the discourse among energy has changed a lot because with the Ukraine-Russia war, the whole conversation among dependency on energy has shifted, right? So even people, and of course Switzerland is a bit special, they have referendums for everything, but even people have been like, why are we dependent on this pipeline and that pipeline? Yes, we don't have so much sun, but Switzerland is very good at, for example, hydropower, right? And there's conversations about nuclear power. There's all these conversations that are going on, thermal power, thermal energy, all that. So there is conversations happening in the global north with people who want to make a change. And it's that level of what change would that governments make is where the change is. But at the same time, as Hugo rightly mentioned, we are feeling it in Switzerland and the global north. I have been used to in Sri Lanka having had air conditioning summer, right? I mean, it's always summer in Sri Lanka. But Switzerland does not have air conditioning. It's not in their practice to have it. It's also very expensive. If you do, you have a tax, which is good, right? But there's different ways to do it. How are they doing it? Taking water from the lake, cooling buildings during winter, using thermal heat to cool the buildings. But they are so ill-prepared with the way they have constructed buildings to keep, because the norm is to keep heat in. But now you're hitting 39 at summer. Or when I landed from Sri Lanka in January, mid-January, it was 25 degrees. I mean, I was like, this is not the Switzerland I knew when I came there. So even there is a need to change, and they're seeing it, and they're talking about it. They're trying to do a lot of things, greening urban areas, etc., looking at how do you reduce impacts of heat waves, etc. So there is things happening. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yeah, but these are things that we can also share. That technology needs to be shared. That knowledge, and Global South can teach a lot to the Global North of what they've been doing. So I think
and it does highlight what is a mild inconvenience versus what is a life-changing event. Maurice, the last word.
And I look at adaptation maybe not in a negative from the work we do. I think it's a positive that we have to build that resilience of communities. So it comes back to the fairness and justice. We have a responsibility now to help the communities we work with in the Global South to be able to deal with the mess we caused. But we also need greater urgency in the Global North. Even here, like we know, like the debates get toxic. Grew up on a farm. We know all the issues, but like we need to have a much more mature debate and much more realism of what the impacts are. And I suppose I'm in a lucky position that I blow my carbon budget personally, and I get to see the situation in many of the communities we work with, and it is horrendous. And I think if many of the people here could see that situation for real, then they would have a very different viewpoint, and it's really shocking. But it will come here, like we're going to see it. And it is, again, it's going to be the most marginalized communities here. I'll be okay. I have a house that's higher up from the seafront. I have an income. It's, again, going to be the most marginalized people in this country and Europe who have least voice, who have least agency, who will, again, get left behind, unfortunately.
And we'll close the session on that note. Thanks so much.